If you see an upside-down cross today, you probably think of horror movies, rebellion, or some kind of dark anti-religious symbol. But for nearly 2,000 years, this was the cross of St. Peter. It remains an official symbol of the papacy and one of the oldest Christian emblems of absolute humility. Peter served as the chief architect of the early church. He wielded absolute authority over a movement that was rapidly spreading across the Roman world, acting as its primary builder and supreme leader. Yet, when he was sentenced to death in Rome, historical accounts tell us he made a shocking demand. He asked to be crucified upside down, stating he was entirely unworthy to die in the same manner as his teacher, Jesus. How does a man who wielded that much influence arrive at a place of such profound self-erasure? To understand that, we have to look at how his power was built, by breaking him down. The early Peter was a rough, working-class fisherman from the Sea of Galilee. He was brash, impulsive, and deeply self-reliant, constantly operating on the belief that his own grit and strength could solve any problem. When pressure mounted against the early Christian movement, Peter was the loudest voice in the room. He proudly declared that even if everyone else abandoned Jesus, he would gladly die for him. But a few hours later, when Jesus was actually arrested and the threat of execution became real, that bravado evaporated. Approached by bystanders in a courtyard, a panicked Peter denied even knowing Jesus. He repeated the denial 3 times in rapid succession. At the sound of a rooster crowing, Peter realized what he had done. His entire identity as a strong, self-made loyalist collapsed. But that psychological break created the exact void necessary for a completely different kind of leadership to take hold. Following the crucifixion, a shattered Peter retreated to the only life he knew, fishing on the shores of Galilee. It was here he encountered the resurrected Jesus around a charcoal fire. Instead of scolding him, Jesus asked Peter a simple, painful question. "Do you love me?" He asked it 3 times, purposefully mirroring Peter's 3 courtyard denials. With each response from Peter, Jesus delivered a very specific mandate: feed my sheep. This instruction redefined his role. The command to feed effectively replaced his old impulse for personal ambition, shifting his focus to the daily welfare of the community. Shortly after, this internal shift translated into public action. According to the Book of Acts, the event at Pentecost provided the sudden empowerment Peter needed to speak to the masses. The results were immediate. He began preaching to crowds of thousands, healing the sick in the streets, and rapidly expanding what was then just a small, localized sect. The man who had recently cowered before bystanders was now standing boldly before the very religious leaders who had once terrified him. His fear was gone, replaced by a deep conviction that no longer relied on his own ego. As the movement grew, it hit a major institutional wall. The earliest leaders assumed new followers had to obey strict traditional Jewish laws to join. Peter pushed past those barriers. After experiencing a vision, he traveled to the home of a Roman centurion named Cornelius and welcomed him and other Gentiles into the church, without requiring them to adopt those localized, rigid rules. By doing this, Peter proved he was operating under a new framework. He was willing to prioritize the actual spiritual needs of his followers over the legacy traditions of the institution. We can see the final form of this leadership philosophy near the end of his life, recorded in the letters he wrote to guide struggling, persecuted churches across Asia Minor. In 1 Peter, he deliberately avoids pulling rank. Instead of demanding obedience as a supreme commander, he addresses the local leaders with the Greek term sympresbyteros. He calls himself a co-elder, establishing a lateral, side-by-side relationship. He gives them explicit instructions on how to handle authority. Do not lord it over the people entrusted to you, but lead entirely by being examples to the flock. Decades later, the lesson from that charcoal fire on the beach had become his core operational protocol. To Peter, true leadership meant shepherding. It never meant dominating. This brings us back to Rome and the end of Peter's story. Today, the sheer scale of St. Peter's Basilica stands as a physical monument to the massive global legacy he left behind. But his actual life ended in the dirt as an enemy of the state. When he made his final demand to be crucified upside down, it wasn't a fleeting burst of guilt. That brutal, inverted posture was the logical conclusion of his entire journey. It was the physical manifestation of a man who finally understood that he was completely subordinate to a higher power. Peter's trajectory challenges how we typically measure authority today. We expect our leaders to project constant dominance, infallibility, and raw self-reliance. Peter, instead, allowed his most profound failures to be documented and used his brokenness to relate to the people he led. He modeled a radical idea that authority is measured by the grace to serve those beneath you and the willingness to put the flock before yourself. The inverted cross documents the physical reality of his execution. It remains a stark, enduring icon of the servant leadership that built the church.